Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mary McCarty Arias, and I welcome you to our webinar on integrating vocational services into substance use disorder. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I appreciate people saying hi, Mary. If people want to start writing in who you are and where you're from, that will start to give me an idea of where you are. I know that just as a commercial, the ATTC, the Addiction Technology and Transfer Center, we cover all of New York, all of New Jersey, the Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico. And the good thing about the webinars is that we have often had people from all over the country, in fact, all over the world, because with webinars, you don't have to worry about getting there. You just have to worry about logging on. So we have been working virtually, actually for the past year. I anticipate that we'll still be doing that for a while. And again, I'm glad that you are here. So just if you've taken our courses before, you know that we always have the disclaimer. And what that means is that hello, everybody, as you're getting in here. The disclaimer is that the development of these training materials was supported by a grant. Mike Chappell, he's the director of the ATTC. It's the Northeast and Caribbean ATTC. And I just want to be clear that the contents are solely the responsibility of the Northeast and Caribbean Addiction Technology Transfer Center and do not necessarily represent the official views of SAMHSA. SAMHSA is Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and they're a federal agency that sponsor many programs, including the ATTC, as well as the PTTC, the Prevention Technology and Transfer Center, who we also work with. So that's the disclaimer. Another piece we always put, and I think almost everybody who does trainings for the ATTC and the PTTC, we always like to start with what are some of the values that really come from our programs. And so that's why we often start with talking about words have power and language matters, so that language is important. And we all always say that we want to be talking about people first. So in this case, people are using substances, the person with a disability. And one of the advantages of doing that from a language point of view, it will start to hopefully decrease stigma. Now, this course, and I'll be going over some of the housekeeping, by the way, for those of you who are not sure if you are connected, although probably if you're on the chat, it means you are connected. And we, just so you know, that the source for this course is from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and it came out in 2021, so it's very recent. And what they did was they had integrating vocational services into substance use disorder treatment. And the advisory means that it was updated. For those of you who've been in the field for a while, originally it came out of TIP 38. TIP stands for Treatment and Improvement Protocol, treatment improvement protocols, and those are those free manuals that you can get from SAMHSA. They just came out with actually about 10 others, and so when I saw that this was available, I just kind of jumped on it. All right, so there's my usual picture. I've been in the field for many years, and I've been doing training in co-occurring disorders. So I've done a lot of training, as some of you know, on substance use, on mental health, on HIV, and vocational rehabilitation, which is the title and the source of the course for today. I am a vocational rehabilitation counselor by trade and started working in treatment many years ago, helping people to go back to their jobs and stay in recovery, and or figure out what they wanted to do next, and have done a lot of trainings for some of the agencies that I see listed there. And so I think this is pretty cool because we're going to be talking about work and how that affects recovery. Here's the question you can think about. And again, if you're not comfortable, you don't have to write in. If you are, I'm curious as to what the answer is. So I'm going to give you time to think about this, but what did you want to be when you were 5 years old? What did you want to be when you were 5 years old? Please think about it, write in, and we can see a teacher. Thank you. A doctor, dentist, a teacher and a dancer, a professional athlete, a teacher, lots of teachers so far, an sorry, you know how to pronounce it. A princess, teacher and rich, yes. Teacher, Batman, attorney, a lighthouse keeper. Thanks everybody. Keep writing. An archaeologist. Anybody else? What did you want to be when you were 5 years old? Pediatrician, thank you. Hairdresser, thank you. A nurse. Anybody else? Whenever I ask a question, by the way, there's always kind of method as to a reason why I'm asking the question. And for some of you out there who are vocational rehabilitation counselors and or studied career development, there always is a specific reason why I do that. Anybody else want to write in before I tell you why I asked the question? A pilot, thank you. An astronomer, thank you. An actress. All right, I'll wait like 10 more seconds. And if you didn't write in, and I'll tell everybody what was the logic of the question. But one of the things that one of the reasons I asked the question is because when you look at career development, what people often start with is the fantasy stage, what's called a fantasy stage. And there was a kind of a researcher, his name was Donald Super, and let me just say what Melissa, I know that earlier in my career, those I served weren't asked this question well into adulthood. Actually, that is an important point, by the way, an ice skater, because I want to address that as well, because, you know, when I was preparing for this course again, I was thinking, well, we studied about Donald Super, and he would talk about the fantasy stage. And I'm going to guess because his research was done a while ago, it was probably done in a fairly white group of people. So it might be different again of where you grew up, or it may be different according to race and ethnicity, but they haven't written stuff about that. So we always want to take that into account. So the reason I asked the question is because sometimes what happens is, you know, when some people were writing about being, let's say, a professional athlete or an archaeologist, which, by the way, all of you could grow up and be that. Sometimes what happens is when people are younger, they fantasize about being an actress or a singer or an astronaut or a baseball player. And again, if you talk to some of the baseball players now, they probably wanted to be that. Like if you talk to Derek Jeter, he wanted to be a baseball player his whole life. But for a lot of us, some of those were more like the fantasy stage. So Yeah, thanks for writing in those names. So the fantasy stage is when sometimes, I don't know, when you hear the term fantasy stage, what comes to mind for you? So fantasy stage. You know, I'm going to keep asking you questions because I like to give you something to do. Or I'll keep talking, because one of the things that happens with the fantasy stage is that, you know, sometimes it depends what you see on television. It sometimes depends on, you know, what you learn in school. But sometimes for the fantasy stage, those are things that, yeah, it is really, it does go with Erikson stuff. And one of the reasons, though, it speaks to is that sometimes people will choose things that they read books about, and but we're not necessarily able to do. When I was working in treatment, though, I always used to ask people what they wanted to be when they were 5, because for a lot of people, by the way, they said they never thought about it. And that goes to something that somebody said before, or that if they wanted to, for example, sometimes I was asking this young man in treatment, you know, what did you want to be when you were really young? And he said he did want to be an archaeologist, and he really liked history. And the interesting thing too was that you know, he grew up in the Bronx, and one of the things that he ended up doing, by the way, after going from treatment, was he got a job in the Museum of Natural History. So it's always important to really do what you love. But sometimes what you wanted to be when you were 5 may tell you what you really wanted to do. You know, I say I always wanted to be either a nun or a singer. Not a singing nun, by the way, but what we learn in school, by the way, is that sometimes there's aptitude tests and things you like to do. So I could say that I like to sing, but if you heard me sing, you would say, I don't think that's going to be your career. So, but it was part of my fantasy stage. Now, what happens with people, for example, after the fantasy stages, for some people, they get into an exploration stage in their teens, and then sometimes that they want to, you know, they see maybe that one of their aunts is a nurse, or that they see what people in their neighborhood do, and then they choose to think about that. So teens start to explore what they want to do. It's interesting too, because a lot of times when you ask people what they want to be now, sometimes they say they want to be famous, or they want to be, there's all actually new kind of careers that people can be. But so in the teens, people get to figure out or start to think about what they want to do. In the mid-20s, by the way, to the mid-40s, people start to establish careers, and people have different ways of doing that. Sometimes people get a job as an accountant when they're 22, and they do that for many years. Other times in their people's 20s, they try to experiment with different things before they start to establish what they want to be. So that's just something about if you're on Jeopardy and the topic is stages of vocational rehabilitation, you might get that. Maintenance is a lot of times when people are in their 40s and 50s and they're doing their job. And then one of the last ones is called disengagement, although it's been changed to reinvention, so that retirement today looks a lot different than retirement used to. So think about that. Or, you know, it's funny, a lot of times people expect you, you know, sometimes when I used to ask my nieces and nephews, what do you want to be when you grow up? They're like, I don't know. So I guess we expected some answers. But anyway, that's just the icebreaker to start thinking about it. So the goal for today is to review SAMHSA's advisory publication on integrating vocational services into substance use disorder treatment. And here's the objectives. We'll talk about why work is important. And there's many reasons why work is important, and I'll ask you that probably in a couple of slides. We'll also look at the key messages about vocational rehabilitation. that came from that advisory in substance use disorder treatment. We'll look at some of the barriers to employment. So for our clients, so some of them are internal, some of them are external, and we'll kind of review them and look at ways to help people overcome some of them, or for you to be able to help them figure out what's a good thing to pursue. We'll look at the components of vocational rehabilitation services. And then the interesting thing too is that for those of you who are peers, is that peers have been working with different treatment centers to help people find their careers, or to do something like to oh, sorry, sometimes when I read the chat and then I'm talking, I lose my train of thought. But let me just go back to, it's important that for peers, sometimes they'll be able to accompany a client to an interview. And I know these days everything's been done virtually, but they've been really helpful in that. So to answer the question about the handouts or the slides, you will get a copy tomorrow. What you can do, by the way, with that publication, when you go, you can Google it later on or tomorrow, and you can download it, and it's only 11 pages. All right, so let's talk about then, what's the definition of work? So this comes again from tip 38, and you can take a look at it, and here's what they say. So it is a purposeful act that produces something of economic or social value, such as goods or services. So you know the question I'm going to ask is, what do you think of that definition? It's a purposeful act that produces something of economic or social value, such as goods or services. What do you think? Yeah, it's too confined. Yes, it's very general. Absolutely. To fulfill adult lifestyle, provide financial means, yes, socialization, explore interests. And those are some of the benefits that we get out of work. You know, sometimes when we used to present this, one of the issues that often would come up is, do you have to have a job where you get paid? Or for those of you who are taking care of children, is that work? Yes, it is. Do you get paid for it? No. But it is, as if you look at the definition, it produces social value and services. So I'm playing with that in a sense, but sometimes when we look at how we define work, and many of you are employed, yeah, mother's work is never done. So it's a job that has a lot of overtime that you don't get paid for. I think it's never done even as you get older too. So this is just to kind of start off the definition of work. So the next slide, let's look at, and I am going to ask you to write in, what do you think about the importance of work? So what are some of the benefits people get from work? If you want to share about yourself, like what do you get from your jobs? What do you get? And I will ask people to write in, because this can go in a variety of ways. What are some of the benefits of work? Yes, the daily routine, which relieves boredom. Yeah, and routine and structure is really important. A purpose. Oh yeah, work-life balance. That's a whole challenge as well. Social wellness, keeping you busy, mentally and physically occupied. Psychically, I mean, you feel useful and smart. Personal satisfaction, a sense of independence, quality of life. Thanks for writing those in. So I think if people want to keep writing some of those things, a paycheck. Yes, sometimes that's the first thing people say. To be physically occupied. You know, it's giving back, helping others to make a difference. Oh yes, to the person who wrote privately about what Freud said about love and work. To develop self-esteem, helping others, giving back. Anybody else want to write in? To develop, yes, financial stability, absolutely. Independence, thank you. Self-satisfaction. Anybody else? What are some of the benefits people get from work or you get from work? So we've seen a variety of things. Yes, a sense of community. Improved quality of life. Thank you. All right, let me go to the next one then, and we'll look at, it's just another way of looking at the benefits of work. Yes, discipline, consistency, social engagement. You know, these are all things, by the way, that we get out of work. And it's also, I think, important as our clients return to work or go to work, because, you know, when we talk about the benefits of work, we could break it down biologically or physically, psychologically, social, and spiritual. And so those were some of the things that people said. So, for example, if you look at the physical benefits of work, you can do things like buy food, pay rent. I was thinking even what I miss is that what I miss in going to the office is getting out of my apartment and walking to the train or walking to the subway or walking around the office. So there's a lot of physical, and depending on what you do for a living, some people get a lot of exercise on their job. For those of you who are nurses, you probably run around a lot. And there are definitely physical reasons in terms of benefits. Let's look at psychological, and actually some of you already said that. And it's important because, you know, a lot of times in our culture, and I don't know if this year's been changed almost everything that I thought I knew, but sometimes when you meet people, they ask you, you know, what do you do for a living? And depending on what you say, you're either the conversation continues or the conversation stops, or if you're in a club and you want to find out what somebody does and they tell you something, they decide whether they're going to hang with you or not. So it gives people actually I think a sense of self-worth, a sense of self-esteem. So sometimes when people lose their jobs, and one of the big traumas, by the way, for this pandemic was people who lost their jobs really dealt with a fair amount of trauma. And so if you got to keep your job, even if, you know, you're working from home or something, in a way, again, it kept us structured, something to do, kept the paycheck coming. But people often get a sense of their self-worth by what they do. Now, socially, and many of you wrote this down, so work provides structure, it provides socialization, and I guess before the pandemic, you know, sometimes you go to your office and you go to the water cooler or wherever people would go hang out to get coffee. It gave you the opportunity to talk to people. And I know there's one agency that I've worked with where on Mondays they have a virtual coffee break and they all get together. But sometimes that socialization, because I think what people especially have complained about this year is isolation. So with work, it will break the isolation and gives people the opportunity to socialize. And, you know, one of the things too is under normal circumstances, whatever normal circumstances were or will be, sometimes we spend our best waking hours at a job. And so it's really important to kind of look at who you work with and what you do. Yeah, and somebody wrote in privately about how we define work and how it relates to our identity. It's a cultural experience, and losing a job in our culture can be devastating to people's identity. Absolutely. And under non-COVID situations, it could be devastating. And again, for many people last year were trying to figure out when they lost their job, how are they going to get another job? So some people have been able to get work and some people have not. But socially, it's an important piece. And it's why sometimes when people retire, they sometimes lose that identity. I remember working with a patient once, and this was in a hospital that I worked in, and he was from Japan, and he had worked many hours for I think a car company. And when he stopped working, he went into a depression. Now, does everybody have to do that? No, not necessarily. But he ended up being hospitalized for depression because of the retirement. So hopefully that won't happen to any of you out there who are thinking about retiring. But it does speak to, again, of how changes we go through. And I think also it's important to look at kind of the spiritual benefits of work. And the term vocation, vocare in Latin, is calling. And I don't know about you, but for many people in the helping profession, they sometimes look at what they do as a calling. Many people who are in recovery work as counselors. Why? To kind of give back. And some people had said that, but also it's kind of this calling to help people. Other people become, let's say, nurses because of a calling. And so I think it's important to kind of look at the spiritual benefits of work. I think as we know what happens with, they all overlap. So sometimes what's physical will also be psychological, will also be social, and which will also be spiritual. I think for me, the take home is when I worked with people is to really doing work that you love. Like if you really don't like your job, it makes your life miserable. You don't have to write in any of that, by the way, if you hate your job. But when you have a job that you don't like, it because you have to spend so much time working, it really it affects people. I don't know what'll happen actually post-COVID. I think sometimes what happens is people might have been home figuring out that they liked their job or didn't want to do it anymore. For example, after 9/11, what happened was a lot of people reassessed what they wanted to do for a living. And some people said, you know what, I never really wanted to be an accountant. I wanted to be a teacher. But my parents told me I should become an accountant, and so sometimes people made changes. I had somebody I know who actually was an accountant and decided to be a firefighter and really loves that and sees that as a calling. So we'll see what happens as a result of the pandemic. All right, so those are the benefits of work. What we'll do is we'll start to look at what were some of the key messages that were and there's 3 slides for them. Some of the key messages around employment that came in that document. So let's look at the first one. Now, you can agree with this or you don't have to agree. And you can also let me know what you think about some of those. So one of the first key messages is that vocational services should be introduced as early as possible in substance use disorder treatment and be an integral component of the treatment plan. You know, sometimes what people used to do is when they went into treatment, they also they would ask questions like, can I get a job after this? And so it's an important part. If you look at all the benefits of work, and actually all of those benefits of work can help people in their recovery. So look at, for example, having structure, having a place to go, and having a paycheck. Okay, so, oh yeah, and I'm going to read this since it's to I'll read it what somebody just wrote in. I see a lot of long-term military officers that when they retire, they really spiral out of their comfort zone. They miss the stability and the sense of purpose. They like being in control. They like the workouts. Then it all goes away. Hard to replace that. So it speaks, by the way, if you're working with people who've been in the military, sometimes when people have had jobs where there's a lot of adrenaline, like firefighters, I guess police people, other jobs. Look at some of the football players, some of the athletes, what happens to them when they retire. So you kind of want to have your, I always say have your antenna up. You can't see me, but I would say if I were in person, actually I'll say it, that you want to keep your antenna up when you look at what people were doing and what kind of help they need. So it really speaks to, again, of starting early. Now, it doesn't mean, by the way, if somebody's withdrawing from a substance that you're saying, okay, you're going to go for an interview, but sometimes starting the process, or when you do assessments that for initial assessments should include something about employment. Yeah, somebody wrote in privately that somebody was confused picking out clothes when if you were wearing a uniform in the military and then all of a sudden you have to pick out your clothing. So some of those activities of daily living that we take for granted can be challenging. So, and we'll talk later on about habilitation as opposed to even rehabilitation. Now, another thing that's important is that vocational plans should recognize the challenges posed to clients whose initial options may be limited to low-paying service sector jobs. This became a challenge, for example, and when you think about what the how much people make at some of the jobs, there's been everybody doesn't want people to make $15 an hour, which in most places like New York, you can't really live on if you make less than that. And some of you are from states also where you need that. But what I used to find in treatment is that sometimes if somebody was doing something, let's say it was an illegal job, they were dealing or they were running numbers or whatever they were doing, they made a lot more money than they would make in a working at McDonald's or something. I'm just using that as an example, but some people like that, some people don't. But it speaks to, again, of I also worked in some women's programs where some of the women were dancers. They were exotic dancers and they made a lot of money. And some of the challenges were that they would often tell their counselors that they made so much more money than they did, and yet they had to look at how some of those jobs would help their recovery or get in the way, but that becomes a challenge. And if you don't have a vocational rehabilitation counselor on staff, you should establish relationships with local VR counselors. I think there's some people out there, and I don't want to call them out, but they work for agencies that help people with employment. And if they want to write into everyone who they are, I'd appreciate that. What's important is that, for example, in New York, it's called Access VR. It's called different things in different states. It used to be called, say, for example, the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation. And it's really helpful if you have relationships with some of those local counselors to find out what do you need to do to get into some of their services. And so if some of you who work for those agencies that deal with employment and substance use want to write in, please do, and we'll read that out loud. I just don't like to put people on the spot. But I think it's important to, again, to develop relationships. And yeah, it's also important, again, to establish looking at any kind of relationships with job training programs, community colleges, GED programs, and employers. Now, it's always interesting because you have a lot to do with your work in general, but it's really helpful. It's really win-win to have some of some of you developing referrals or relationships with some of those programs. What sometimes people don't know is that if a company hires somebody in recovery, they will get a they'll get a tax credit for that. And so I remember a long time ago, I met some of the HR people who were at the Marriott Corporation, and actually they had to hire people with disabilities, which included substance use as part of their evaluation. So I think that's important to look at as well. Okay, so we do have a CRC. Welcome. And you are the Voc Rehab counselor at a residential SUD program in Binghamton. Thank you for writing that in. And we used to do a lot of training in Binghamton. I'm sorry that I haven't been able to go there recently. So thank you for writing that in, because if you have the opportunity to work with a Voc Rehab counselor, go for it. And again, like all the cities, I know in New York, almost all of the big cities, even the smaller ones, will have offices of vocational rehabilitation counselors. And, again, the way you do vocational rehab services will vary according to your the treatment intensity and the setting. And I'll go into that later, because if you're at a residential treatment site, there are certainly opportunities to help people figure out what they want to do, or jobs at the site. Some of the treatment centers or the short term are not as easy to do it, but it's important to look at. Another big thing, by the way, is that clients really need to access online job resources and get training on how to use them. And okay, there's a few Voc Rehab counselors out there. I'll be waving to you. Really, these days, if you don't know how to use a computer, it's really hard to get a job. Like, for example, if you want to be an auto mechanic, you still have to know how to use a computer. And I think I was doing one of the trainings on methamphetamines, and we showed a movie that was made in 2008, and people were talking about recovery. And in the video there, they had a lot of the clients sitting around reading the newspaper ads. And so people don't do that anymore. And you'll have actually at the end of the presentation, or at some of the slides towards the end, where you can go for that, but it's really important as well. So those are some of the key messages, and I'm glad I've got some Voc Rehab counselors out there. And if you don't know any Voc Rehab counselors, try to find them. In New York, by the way, New York City, for those of you who are in the 5 boroughs, actually in Long Island as well, there is an agency, and I'm going to write this in, called Avrasa. I'm going to put it in the chat. And it is the Association of Voc Rehab Counselors in Substance Abuse. I know we don't use the term abuse anymore, but if you go to their website for New York, you can find out that for New York City, you can find out more information. And there is also, yes, it's a wonderful organization. And they also have partner with Long Island. So it's a really good place for you to connect with some of the best Voc Rehab counselors in the city. I'm a bit biased because I used to teach at NYU, and I taught in the vocational rehabilitation program. And so many of my former students are now heads of a lot of these programs. So yes, that they also are having they have trainings every month or every other month. And if you want to find out, what's going on in terms of employment, I'm going to push that. So thanks for agreeing with me. And so I think it's really important. So those are the key messages. Let's go to some of the barriers to employment. I mean, I'll start with internal, and then the next one we'll look at external. So again, for the Voc Rehab counselors who want to write in examples, I'd be glad if you do that. But these are some of the things that, what are some of the barriers? So first one is educational deficits. And one of the things that people used to make mistakes, and for a lot of people, if they hadn't finished high school or they didn't get a GED, we used to find out that there is a correlation between substance use and learning disabilities. Now, what came first? We don't know, but sometimes if people had learning disabilities, it put them at high risk for substance use. And sometimes what happens is not everybody had an evaluation in their school where they were told that they had a learning disability. They just were getting into trouble. So educational deficits is something that has to be dealt with as well. I remember I was doing a group a long time ago and somebody said they wanted to be a lawyer, which I thought, okay, that's good. And it turned out that they hadn't finished high school. And one of the good things, though, about if you go to some good vocational rehab counselors is you can start to think of, okay, what do I have to do first? First, I have to finish high school, then I have to go to college, then I have to go to law school. You don't have to all do it in a day, but sometimes to help people and give them hope, and not fake hope, but the opportunity for them to figure out what they want to do. So sometimes educational deficits will prevent people from successful employment. Another thing is that sometimes people haven't had any vocational training. Oh, yes. Thank you for, so language skills can be a barrier. Absolutely. It's a sad thing because it makes me think of, for example, for sometimes when people, if English is not their first language, I know that some agencies will kind of automatically tell somebody they should go into maintenance or be a cleaning person because they don't speak English. And so that can be a barrier, and that's why it's helpful too, as part of their treatment plan is to figure out what they want to do with that. Oh, yes. Thank you, Alan. Potential lack of a driver's license or an ID, social security card, birth certificate. Yep. Housing, not near public transportation. Thank you. Childcare, a lack of childcare. Some of the soft skills. And some of those soft skills are things, and you could write it in as well, but sometimes being able to kind of talk to people is a job, and kind of, they're saying actually that people are going to have to relearn some of those soft skills if you've been working at home and not talking to anybody. Yeah, some people just don't know. So as y'all can see, and thanks, Ellen, for writing this in, those potential barriers are all there as well. Let me see if what we have that overlaps. Actually, co-occurring and or / physical disabilities, and actually people with co-occurring disorders, by the way, do work, but it's important that they get treatment for that. Unrealistic expectations, lack of familiarity with workplace culture. Sometimes we used to talk about, how sometimes at your job there's the written rules and there's an unwritten rules. And it's like, how do you find out what the unwritten rules are? You kind of have to ask around, but sometimes people would make mistakes based on not figuring out the culture. Another big thing that people often have dealt with is the demands of work and treatment. And I remember many years ago when welfare reform changed, a lot of people who were on welfare had to go to treatment. They had to go to jobs, and a lot of the women had to take care of their children, and they were going on buses, getting up at 3:30 in the morning to drop their children off at their parents' house. And it was really, when you looked at from a strengths model about what people were doing, it was really hard. Yeah, I agree. Lack of mentorship is also a barrier. And it's one of those things too. In fact, they've just done, they've done a lot of studies on this, by the way, I think Oprah just is coming out with a book. It's on trauma. But I think what she says, although other people have said this before, is that sometimes when you're growing up, let's say your parents are not, either they're not there or they're not in a position to kind of help, that sometimes having a neighbor or an aunt or your first grade teacher, that really sets people up for success. And actually, mentorship programs, I think, have also been very successful when they have done them in the field of substance use. You know what, we'll get to, oh, somebody just asked, what roles does discrimination play in reaching vocational goals? I'll go to that on the next slide when we look at some of the external ones. So yes, it definitely plays a part. The last bullet on this is a history of incarceration, and we'll talk about how to kind of work with that. Some of you are good at helping people with histories of incarceration get jobs. And we'll talk also about on the next slide, or one of the next slides, about ban the box and what that means. So yeah, so those are the, on this slide, they're kind of internal. Now let's look at external. And these are some of the things that the person was just writing in about discrimination around gender, race. Yes, it plays an important part. And so here's a couple of things, and you can add as we go along. So employer bias. So technically, substance use is covered by the American for Disabilities Act. And so that you can't discriminate on, you can't discriminate against somebody because of their substance use on that. So that has been a big challenge. And one of the things that happens too is if you have like 100 people applying for a job and they think that somebody has a substance use problem, they'll just pick somebody else, and then this way they'll cover their butt. So employer bias is important. What I used to sometimes do is find out who was in recovery, which employers were in recovery, or if people went to NA or AA. And I know you don't go there to find a job, but it's sometimes helpful to find out who's in recovery because they'll hire people. Let me see what people are writing in. Are we going to discuss how to teach advocacy skills to this population? We'll start to, not going to do a big focus on that, like the importance of them knowing their rights and how to exercise them in the workplace. Yes, we can, it's not going to be a deep dive into that, but we can touch on that. Yeah, again, and having to pick up children from school, so it can be an external barrier. Yeah, it's an external barrier as well. Just as you see there, and people are writing in things, limited opportunities to progress, lack of access to job search tools. And again, I know some of your agencies provide computers for people, and many people have phones, but it is really hard if you don't have access to some of the tools that you're expected to do. Some of the local job training programs may not support people in recovery. And again, sometimes there's a lack of coordination among treatment programs, vocational services, and employers. You know, there was a program called CASA, which was it's called the Center of Addiction and Substance Abuse at Columbia University. It's actually changed names, but they had a program where they picked out 12 programs throughout the country, and they focused on women who were dealing with drug problems and also had children. And what they did was they got together people in job training, also people in drug treatment, people from the welfare office, and people from the domestic violence agencies, and they worked together to really help the women. And it was interesting because they were 4 different cultures, and sometimes the cultures didn't mesh, but getting everybody to, but it was just really hard it was a challenge, but it worked for a lot of people. Sometimes they had smaller programs where people had a lot of support, and that was helpful. Okay, as somebody's written, oh, if you have trouble listening on your cell phone, Oh yeah, people have eliminated vocational services, and that I think is a mistake. Because one of the things we know is that, and it's probably on another slide, but when people have jobs, they have actually less relapse, and when they do relapse, it's a shorter period of relapse. So I think it's important to look at that as well. Now, another thing to look at that you may have heard is something called Ban the Box, and it was also called the Fair Chance Act. And what that did, and it will vary according to states, by the way, but it eliminated the question on a job application about criminal history. And it reduces, as it says there, the employer's accessibility to criminal records until later in the process. So remember when you used to go in for a job interview? I mean, or if you were filling out an application, and there was always a question about, have you been convicted of a crime? And sometimes people wouldn't want to fill it out. Sometimes people would say, yes, we'll discuss an interview, but it really kind of set up red flags, by the way, when people didn't answer it. The challenge, by the way, was that the question was, have you been convicted of a crime, not have you been arrested? So sometimes some of the when people were applying for jobs, you'd find out that they were being asked questions that were illegal. So what they've been doing, and actually, if you want to find out a lot of information, I'm going to type in the Legal Action Center. Because they can talk about it in great detail, but basically what's supposed to happen is that rather than them asking you about your criminal history at the beginning when you're filling out the application, it would be later on after they are thinking about offering you a job. Now, I will say that certain crimes would preclude employment in some fields. So, for example, I knew somebody who worked at Citibank, and she said that it would be okay if you were convicted of murder, but you couldn't have been convicted of robbing a bank. Or you couldn't, if you were convicted of robbery, you wouldn't be able to work in a jewelry store. If you were convicted of sexual abuse of a minor, there's no way in hell you're going to be a teacher or a teacher's aide. So that is also helpful to know because you don't want to steer people the wrong way. I found that I used to meet people who, when they were in prison, they were given a job training program, which I think they're not as generous about that anymore, but the job training program this person was given was about childcare, and they didn't take into account what his crime was. So they really kind of set him up for failure. So ban the box, and it'll ban the box, and I have this on the next slide, is yeah, the Legal Action Center is great. They do a lot of webinars, by the way. They have a great website, and you can call them with questions. I know people who work there, and whenever I want like a clear answer about something like ban the box or something around HIV, go to them. Wherever you are in the country, by the way, you can go to them. They happen to have their offices in New York, but they're my go-to when I want to find out information that's written clearly. And again, they do webinars too. Different states, by the way, and this is as of January 2020, different states have different laws about the banning the box. And so 35 states, which includes New York, by the way, and the District of Columbia have banned the box. Also in some cities, so I think, for example, Rochester, Buffalo, a lot of the cities have banned the box as well. Oh yeah, it's just if I'm going to read the question that Alexander wrote to everyone. Do you feel people should focus more on recognizing triggers or developing relapse prevention skills? I think that's part of it, by the way, in returning to work and also in maintenance and job retention. You know what else I think when you're asking about stages of change, you could be in stages of change about getting a job, by the way. So you could be like Pre-contemplation, I don't need a job. Contemplation, I'm thinking about getting one. So you want to work with people around it. The reality, by the way, is the majority of people who use drugs are already working. The majority of people who are using drugs are already working. So, yeah, I know it's actually some of you, actually the people at Access VR have a lot of clients, and many of you have a lot of clients. Yeah, and actually, if we're talking about the courts, oh yeah, that whole thing about credit history, they're really, I know they check that and they're not supposed to. You know what I think, and this is where I think the Legal Action Center, and I started to ask some of my friends in the field, like I can tell you what the book says about ban the box, but there were articles, by the way, that said that it has been used against people, that it has been or used against people. So the idea, and it was I think it was passed when President Obama was president. The idea was really to help people, but it's been used against people. So I don't know the answer of, in reality, how well it works, but I think we always need to know what the law is so that, in fact, going back to one of the questions on advocacy, is we could tell people what the law is and also how to advocate for themselves or how to find out information from Legal Action Center so they can advocate for themselves. So I'm just reading what people are writing. In New York State courts, fines are imposed on criminal dockets. If you're unable to pay, judgment is entered on that case. So the credit history is tarnished. Yeah, and that becomes, it has, unfortunately, it used to be that they weren't allowed to get credit, but I think they do. And some of you who work for some of those agencies can let me know whether that is true or not. And oh, thanks. Actually, as Gary wrote in, the federal bond program covers bad or no credit. So I think, that kind of goes back to what else needs to be cleared up before you can work. So that's why when we talk about, say, the vocational process, it's not just like running out to get a job. It's what do you need to do? What do you need to clear up so that you will be employable? So thanks everybody for writing those things in. And actually, this gets into the components of VR services. Here's the key. Assessments are always first. So it's not like you just, do you ever do this where sometimes you go to Indeed.com and you think, oh, let me look for a job today. And you really don't know what you're looking for, or our clients might not know what they're looking for, but it is important to really look at assessments. I think it's important, and some of you do those testing on what a person's aptitudes are and what are their interests, so that you can really help steer people towards what they want to do. The assessments will also tell you things like criminal history or some of the barriers that also need to work with. So assessment is always first. I remember in grad school, one of our professors she reprimanded us for not doing good assessments, because when we didn't do good assessments, we jumped in to kind of fix the problem. And a lot of times we were fixing the problem that we thought needed fixing, and we were not doing a good job. But anyway, that's what I remember. So assessment, really important. Vocational planning. So that is really, again, what do you want to do? How are you going to get there? Another thing is, and some of these things are things that people have written in, is basic problem solving and coping skills. That is always a challenge. Remember, sometimes people would get a job and after lunch they would call in and they'd tell their boss, I'm not coming back today, and I'm not coming back for the rest of the year. I quit. And so sometimes people were struggling with kind of the discomfort that they felt or whatever. They didn't feel comfortable at their jobs, and they didn't have a lot of strong coping skills. Sometimes getting, as we said before, what's the education, what's the skills training? Another thing to keep in mind around skills training and education is, if you look at what the substance that was being used, how did the substance that was being used affect any, cognitive deficits? So for example, sometimes when people are using methamphetamines and they have they develop some cognitive deficits. Maybe prior to them using this substance, they might have been able to function in one job, but after and getting into recovery, they still are not ready to return to that job. And again, then helping people connect with the sources of employment. So it's always, those are some of the components. Now, how do we integrate them? And these were things that some of you already talked about, like we talk about rehabilitation. Oh, yes, getting work equipment. Yes, steel toe shoes can run $120. A lot of times people used to have their own tools, by the way, and tools are very expensive. And sometimes people might have sold their tools to support their substance use habit. And so it just again becomes another barrier that perhaps you can help them with. Thanks again for everybody writing in. And just to kind of go back to the habilitation skills, like sometimes, for example, we talk about rehabilitation, but what are some of the habilitation skills that people need? And some of you do trainings on these where you talk about time management skills. Actually, getting an ID would be part of habilitation, the activities of daily living. So sometimes people haven't learned things about grooming or bathing. Somebody was telling me that since they've been working at home, I'm not mentioning any names, but sometimes people say if they've been working at home and wearing sweatpants, like how often do you wash them, or things you can get away with working at home, you can't get away with when you are working. Another person was telling me a story about how they broke 2 of their front teeth during this time, but they were really glad that they could wear a mask all the time, because if you go for a job and you don't have teeth, it's going to impact, and actually it impacts a lot of things on life. And some of you have heard me tell this story before, but I worked for a program where they sent all the women out for jobs. None of them got them. The only intervention they did was they had them all have their teeth fixed, and guess what? They all got the jobs. And so a person's teeth tell an employer a lot about them. And so it's why I see people in early recovery, or as they get better, they'll get their teeth fixed. So it becomes, something that you look better, you can talk better, you feel more comfortable. Oh, yes. Thank you, Dorna, for writing. More focus needed on one barrier. I noticed assisting client to work with others who are not in recovery due to stigma and previous experience of stigma when you share your recovery or still in treatment, especially methadone treatment. One of the things we often use to teach is that you don't have to share that information at work. In fact, when people ask you at the job, how are you feeling today? They don't really want to know how you're feeling. It's just one of those, I don't know, small talk kind of things. And that what happens is, as people share their information on the job, that if all of a sudden somebody's pocketbook is missing, then who's going to get blamed? The person who shared they were in recovery. So I think that's important to look at. Sometimes people don't feel comfortable with people who are not in recovery. It depends where you work. For many of our jobs, like in treatment, many people are in recovery, but in other areas they're not. So it's part of those soft skills, I think. Other things about integrating is encouragement to focus on vocational planning. Actually practicing, if you have the ability to help anybody focus or practice with their computer skills, that can be really helpful. Many of you do groups to help people boost their self-esteem. That's all part of work. And understand when and how to refer clients to a trained VR counselor. It's helpful, by the way. For example, some of the people at Access VR, they'll have it requires to have a disability. It's also required that the disability prevents you from getting a job. They also in a lot of cases, sometimes people would prefer that people know what they want to do before they make that referral, and that will vary according to the agency. So I think it's important to kind of look at that as well. I mean, other things of how they're integrated is sometimes co-located programs. It's interesting too, though, you know, when they have those one-stops where you can get all of your treatment in one place, that's really good in terms of transportation. But I'll give you an example of a program I was working with in Cincinnati where the drug treatment program was on the same floor as the job training program. And you know what happened? Some of the women who were in treatment, quote, and I'm quoting them, they didn't feel worthy of going to see, they saw the job people going in and they were wearing suits and they looked like they were dressed for work, and their sense of self-worth almost became a barrier for them wanting to go or thinking they deserved to go into the program. So what the easy part is that sometimes it's just a matter of talking to each other, of if you're co-located with another program that can be helpful to you, because it's really win-win. And again, different multidisciplinary teams of how it's integrated. Okay, so other things to keep in mind, and this will talk about the different kinds of treatment that people are working at and how vocational rehabilitation can be involved in that, or where you can go with that. And you know, one of the things about where it says there, the more intense the program, the easier it is to integrate VR services. If you have programs that are residential and people are staying there for a while, you can do a number of things. And if people want to write in what you do, that's helpful too. But here's what you can do. It's easy to give people jobs at a treatment center. So you know how, for example, at some of the therapeutic communities, you'd have a job and you'd either be working in the kitchen or you'd be cleaning. Those are, now somebody might not want to do that for a living, but it gives them an opportunity to find out if they like what they're doing. So somebody who's working in the kitchen might say, I really like doing this. Maybe I can get into a Culinary Institute program. And some people say, no, I don't want to do anything on that. And you know, they say, well, I don't want to do any cleaning. So it just gives you an opportunity. Another thing you can do is you can have clients shadow counselors. You know, what used to happen is sometimes we'd have somebody shadow a counselor because people would say, I want to be a counselor when I get out of treatment. And what they would come back to us and say is, I changed my mind. I don't want to be a counselor. There's too much paperwork. There's too much stuff you have to do other than just helping people. So it just gives people an opportunity to find out what they like to do. I know in some of the programs, actually throughout the country, they have gardening programs. And so there's something about getting your hands dirty or in dirt that can be very healing to people. And I've seen them in some of the cities and in some of the rural sites. So I think that's important to look at as well. Another thing that sometimes helps is that if you have a graduate of the program who's employed, come back and tell them what they're doing, what worked for them, what some of their challenges are, and also to see how they kind of, sometimes teaching people how once you get the job, how do you get ahead on the job so that people don't just think they're going to be in one job for the rest of their life. So in a where there's an intense program. Oh yeah, what about the DOE program, Ready, Willing, and Able? I think that's a really good program, by the way. In that, again, I think they work with people who are homeless. They have people working on the street. They get an allowance, or they get paid. I don't know how much they get paid. I don't know if they're still on any kind of disability or whatever, but I think it's, again, when people are working, it can be really helpful. Oh yeah, kitchen, business office, janitorial maintenance. Thank you, Michelle, for writing that in. Recovery coach training. So those are all things that people can be, you can talk to people about. Yes, the ACE program. I love the ACE program, if we're talking about the same one. So there's just a variety of things that you can do. And I think there's some of my friends from NADAP who are on, which is also works actually with the ACE program. And so they are working closely with people around employment. Okay, so the more intense the program, the easier it is to integrate VR services. Yeah, sometimes work adjustment training was sometimes done at places where what they really focused on were things like getting to work on time, working with a supervisor, how to kind of fit in to the culture of where you are in terms of work. And I think that is helpful. There's another term called situational assessment. And then that's where somebody sees a job or they're doing it, and then you just give them an opportunity to do it. And then they could tell you whether, no, I don't like doing that, or yes, I do like doing that. Yes, the Fortune Society has a long history of helping ex-offenders return to society in the workforce. Yeah, they do. And I think, again, they can help people with some of those, I'm going to say, external and internal barriers. And I think what happens too is as agencies have, let's say, relationships with corporations or jobs, that can really help ease the way. And so, yes, some of those, and they'll teach you how to do a lot of that stuff. So, so yeah, residential, easier to look at work. Now, if somebody is in an outpatient program, it depends like on how long the outpatient program is. You can actually do, I think it's important to look at vocational assessment at intake. Oh yeah, actually, thanks for people writing and promoting networking in a congregate setting. Absolutely. An 8-week career development workshop. Thank you, because I think those are really important things, and they speak to, again, when you think about returning to, quote, society, having a job is going to be an important part. So some of the outpatient programs are quicker. You don't have as much time. What I used to find is that sometimes if you work with people who already have jobs, you can spend time talking about, actually, I used to do a course called, or a group called Returning to Work and Recovery, and we would look at what are the typical triggers. Somebody was asking about this before. What are typical triggers on the job, and what are you going to do about them? And, you know, it could be anything from payday to people drinking or drugging on the job, to having too much supervision, to not having enough supervision, for not getting along with the supervisor, sometimes working a night shift. Those are all could be triggers for some people. But with the outpatient programs, you could, you know, you just start, and then maybe they need to make the referrals. Now, short-term residential, again, and it kind of goes with some of the outpatient, again, depending on how long it is. If it's short-term residential, you may not be able to integrate, but I already said this on the prior slide. I just think it's important to really look at what's the assessment and where can you go and what do you need for that. Thanks, Gary. So the Center for Practice Innovations has an employment resource book available for free download. Thank you. So if everybody can hear that or see that, I think when you get the slides, you don't always get the chat, although you can probably take a picture of it. And I think that that is important to know. All right. Thanks, Gary, for writing in. The website. Appreciate that. All right. Yeah, it depends again on where you are as whether you're working with people who have been employed or are still employed. But again, it's really important. Another one is, you may have heard, some of the CRCs out there know what supported employment is, but supported employment, actually, it's an evidence-based practice for people with mental illness. And what it does is that when people are clients in supported employment, they have job coaches who go out with them to the job and follow them and help them do the job. Now, it's worked with other disabilities. For example, sometimes people who are mentally challenged, sometimes I know some of the programs like Burger King had them. And so if you were one of the counselors, you would be going to Burger King and you would be learning how to serve hamburgers or cook hamburgers. And this way you work closely with the person. I know they had a program at the Botanical Gardens with supported employment. One of the things that sometimes people found in substance use is that some of the clients didn't want a counselor following them around all the time. But I thought it was kind of important to look at, actually, if some of you are talking about working with veterans, is that there was a study done with veterans, and the veterans had co-occurring disorders. So they had substance use, and most of them had depression, and they and many of them were unemployed or recently homeless. And they found that with supported employment, there was an increase in competitive employment. So it's going to work for some people, and I think that is important as well. And, when we talk about the term competitive employment, it does mean kind of a job that pays a wage that you can live on, although that's a challenging thing to say actually on a webinar. But you want to, again, help people. What's that? I think when I went to school at Albany, I think one of the value was like, well, it's like the Army thing, be the best that you can be, or do all the best that you can, but help people find out what they can so they can do the best that they can. Sometimes people, for example, if you haven't worked for a long time, you may have to take a job that you don't like for a little while, but if people know that they can kind of work towards it, or work towards something else, I think that could be helpful as well. Now, people have mentioned about work and relapse. So what do we have here? Yes. So if people are working, as it says there, you can help people cope with the stress of it. Actually, the stress of a job search. When you look at why do people relapse, it's often negative emotional states. The idea is sometimes you apply for a job, you don't get it. And also when people look at jobs, is what jobs have triggers that might not be helpful. Like, so for example, I don't know about you, but like I couldn't work in a bakery because I like food. And I know people say, oh yeah, you get sick of like looking at or eating donuts. But I know me, I couldn't work in a bakery. And sometimes I remember once going into a liquor store and I was looking around and I said to the guy, how do you not drink all of this? And then he tells me, I don't know what made me ask, but he said that he was in recovery, but that he was okay as long as working in the liquor store, all of the bottles of liquor were closed. Whereas I think working as a bartender could be more difficult. Now, can you be a bartender and stay in recovery? Yes. Will it be more difficult? Probably. So you can work with people around how to cope with jobs that have triggers, or if they're choosing jobs, they may want to pick ones that are not their triggers. So it also says there, yeah, and again, depends on stage of recovery. So early recovery versus late recovery. Also, it's one of those, it depends. Yeah, let me see what people have written in. I like to juxtapose job stress to the stress of unemployment and poverty. Actually, that's a good one to look at. And all I could say, like, for example, for myself, I'm very grateful that I have worked during the pandemic. I've worked from home, but yeah, it's been a good thing. Yeah, the Osborne program is another program. And again, they're in the Bronx, and they've done a lot of work with people who have been incarcerated. What I sometimes don't always know, by the way, is did any programs close or connect with other agencies while we had the pandemic? Oh, Exodus. Yes, I've trained there. I love that place. So Exodus is another one. And it's fascinating because they have some of the situations they would have is somebody would come from prison, and as counselors they had been in prison with that person, and so sometimes they had to really work on setting boundaries, or what they were called in prison. They didn't want to be called in at their job. So if you're doing that kind of work, I think it's important to have good clinical supervision. So, but it's great that those programs exist because they provide hope for people. And I know many of the people who work in them who have had histories of incarceration, it's also another way for them to give back, to heal, and be a part of society. So yeah, work and relapse is important. And oh yeah, here it becomes a challenge on that last bullet, that sometimes you can help people, sometimes people are dealing with things like custody issues, immediate financial need, requirements of welfare to work legislation, and demands of the job market. So sometimes those challenges can be overwhelming. And it's funny because they're different agencies, like child welfare, they have their own dates, welfare reform, they have their own stuff. Everybody's got a date and they have a purpose, and they don't always come together all that easily. So sometimes I think it's important to look at that. Another thing is, and I mentioned this at the beginning, but it's the importance of peer support in VR. So I know I've worked with some peers, at least prior to the pandemic. These are some of the things that, and I think you're going to see more peers, by the way. I hope they come back after the pandemic is over. I know some of the agencies have had their peers leave and they weren't able to hire new people, but really a peer can act as a role model in finding and keeping employment, because the client will see somebody who they have maybe a close relationship with, or they feel like, they understand what I'm going through, and they can give them information on how they keep their jobs. Obviously, they offer encouragement and build morale. And one of the things I have found is, for almost every peer that I've worked with, is they were excellent resources in the community of where to go for a job, where to go for this, where to go for food, where to go for everything. And I think that's important. Also, some of the peers, and some of this was in upstate New York, where the peers would accompany people to interviews. Now, again, there's not a lot of in-person interviews going on. A lot of it's still done virtually, but when it's not, sometimes accompaniment can be helpful. A lot of times too, people decide that they want to become a peer as a result of working or hanging out with the peer. What you might find in the future, I just went to a webinar at, we are located at the New York State Psychiatric Institute as part of Columbia Presbyterian Medical School. And what we may find in the future, instead of 911, when somebody has a mental health emergency, they're going to change that number to 988. 988. It's supposed to happen in 2022. And that if you call that number, that you will get a mental health person, or a person who maybe has training in mental health first aid. When you call 911, you could start to connect with the police. So sometimes people want to avoid that as well. All right, moving along, navigating the job market. I just wrote in my notes, COVID, how does that really change things? I think there's a lot that we don't know, and people keep talking about the new normal. Are we going back to normal? Whatever, who knows? We don't know. Let's see. Yeah, peers sometimes are more comfortable than a therapist, depending on confidentiality. Some clients don't like to share things with a therapist, thinking it may cause a response. They feel like they can open up to peers a little easier. And that's that advantage of being a peer. It's kind of like, I don't have to explain myself. And so sometimes the good thing is, I think if peers work closely with counselors, it is a gift to the client. Let's see. As Luis wrote, it's been very difficult for a lot of patients in an outpatient treatment program to maintain and utilize their support systems. Yeah, and you know what? I don't know if group therapy, actually what this Dr. Lieberman said is he can't see that happening. And so, you know, and as you write, a lot of patients are not IT savvy and they're unable to get involved in peer support groups via telehealth and Zoom. That is going to be a big challenge, because what they're saying is that, he said, the silver lining of the pandemic is that people found that you could do things virtually. So if people wanted to go to therapy, but it wasn't serious stuff, some people will continue that way. If it's serious mental illness, they'll need to go in person. But the idea of group therapy with social distancing is not going to work for a while. So yes, that is. And again, not everybody's, I agree, not everybody's got an internet. My sister is a math teacher in Chicago, and she teaches at one of the magnet schools, and she found that for her students, she would actually tape things, well, whatever the word is for tape, she would put videos so that they could watch the videos in the evening, because there might have been a couple of people who needed the computer, and it might have been one of the parents, and actually having the internet. The internet, access to internet is going to be part of the Recovery Act. You know, if you listen to what people are doing in terms of infrastructure, that access to the internet will be part of that. Many people have phones. In fact, there are twice as many phones as there are people in the world. I read that somewhere recently. But having access to the internet is a whole different thing. And also being able to share the internet is challenging as well. So thanks again for writing those, because that's going to be part of actually recovery, part of navigating the job market. And so let's see what else we have there. Setting expectations, plotting a strategy. Sometimes it gives people hope. If you've ever done those vision boards where you make pictures, or you cut out pictures of what you want your life to look like, I think that's helpful. I used to do that with clients, and that to me was very useful. Completing education and training. A lot of times people have not completed something, and so the idea of getting a GED, which by the way is very hard. Some people need more, they need some of the adult basic training and reading, but somehow finishing stuff is helpful. How do you apply for jobs, create a resume? And actually people have already mentioned this about mobile technology and practicing interview skills. Oh yeah, thanks, Alexander. Yes, I agree. I had a patient who was psychiatrically compromised due to only telehealth psych sessions. Patient had to be reassigned to another psychiatrist who would conduct. Yeah, you know what? It's not going to work for everybody. It works for some people, but it's not going to work for everybody. It's also assuming, by the way, you know how some of you used to do home visits? You could go into somebody's home and you could kind of really learn about what was going on in the home. Now, when you're on Zoom and they're on Zoom or FaceTime, you could see what's going on, I suppose, right? But sometimes you don't really have a good sense of it, and that can be I can be dangerous to what's going on. You could have somebody who's a victim of domestic violence, or now it's called intimate partner violence. How do you find that out? You know, I guess if they show up at the session, you know, you can kind of look at it, but it's hard to make an assessment on that. So going back to navigating the job market, some of you are good at helping people come up with reasons of why they have gaps in their employment. So but you don't want to lie, but some of you know how to teach people how to do that appropriately. I think what'll happen is, because so many people lost their jobs this year, gaps in employment will have it won't be as deep or as the same as it used to be. Right. Other things? Actually, we're kind of getting into, let's see. My job is to make sure we finish on time. Employer willingness to hire. This is always a tricky one. Sometimes I'm going to skip to that second. You may need to educate employers. Actually, some of you do that, by the way, in some of your agencies, where you have boards of people come in from could be a bank or other different places where they work and work with clients. Another thing I think you could do is if you have your own, at your own agency, look at who's on the board and where do they work and how can you use that to maybe set up some programs or have them come and talk to people and encourage development of recovery-friendly places. In an ideal world, yes, but as I was saying before, is employers get tax credits for hiring people with disabilities, including substance use and mental illness. Sometimes people can also work with people of how to make accommodations. Like, for example, an accommodation for substance use might be that somebody had to go to an AA meeting during lunch, except if they were, say, writing a grant or something. So sometimes that can be helpful. And oh yeah, thanks, Gary. I think that's good. The purchasing agents, because they have contacts with the vendor. See, I think that's a really good thing, because if people are spending money at your site, it's in their best interests to work together on that. So you just have to get the people involved to agree to that. But I think that's a really good, it's a good place to start. So your people may not want to employ people, but you may work with people around that. All right, so here's some sources for online job searches. Many people are familiar with Monster.com and Indeed.com. The United States Department of Labor has a career one-stop. USA Jobs, I have not gone on those two sites recently, but they used to be good. Actually, each of your states have online resources, and I think that's important. In addition, there's a lot of resources for criminal and juvenile justice involvement. So there's a reentry education toolkit. Actually, these you can Google helping people with criminal histories find work, criminal records and employment, protecting yourself from discrimination. You know what's going to be a good thing, by the way, is now in New York and probably in New Jersey for anybody's there, but if recreational marijuana, I'll say the New York thing because I know that for sure, is that what they will do is they will expunge the records of people who had criminal histories based on marijuana selling or possession, maybe possession more than selling. So that when something gets expunged, it means that an employer does not have access to it. So that will be something. Thursday, I'm doing a training on that, on marijuana. So I have more information on that, on some of those slides. And the good thing about webinars is we don't really close people out on our WebEx program. So Thursday noon, marijuana preparing for change. Yeah, thanks for, yeah, I see that people are writing in organizations. Yeah, thanks again for everybody writing them in. So you could see that 12online.org is very good. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. And the New York State Department of Labor. Yeah, the prime objective. So I think it's important to help people with that. All right, just briefly, the American for Disabilities Act, technically it was passed in 1990 and went into play in 1992. Yeah, there's a lot of things that could be really helpful. And then Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act of 2014, the Affordable Care Act, these are all helpful things. And then Ban the Box, which we had some slides on, can be helpful for employment. Now, if you want to read a manual, you know, I was saying that this course was taken from an edition, they call it an advisory to Tip 38, Integrating Substance Abuse Treatment and Vocational Services. You know, it used to be that you could just go to the SAMHSA website and you'd call them up and they would send you the manuals for free. They don't send them for free lately, but you can download all of them. Just if you have a good printer, or actually if you have a lot of room on your computer. So Tip 38 is about employment. Other things, these are other resources that we kind of mentioned, ensuring people with convictions have a fair chance to work, the National Hire Network, U.S. Department of Labor. So there's no lack of resources. It's just a matter of kind of finding out more information about them.